Good evening, everyone who's joining us. We're just going to give a couple of minutes for everyone to get signed in, and we'll start in about a minute or so. Okay, so I think we can begin. So, good evening. My name is Oris Zakidaiski. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and we are very pleased to co-host tonight's event on the escalation of Russia's aggression in recent weeks against Ukraine with both the Central and Eastern European Council in Canada and the Macdonald Laurier Institute. Just a couple of housekeeping items. After our two presentations, there will be a Q&A session of about 40-45 minutes. I'll ask that when you have questions, please type them into the Q&A function in Zoom, and then we will compile all of them and ask them after our presentations. On December 7th, in a phone call with Russian President Putin, US President Joe Biden, quote, voiced the deep concerns of the United States and our European allies about Russia's escalation of forces surrounding Ukraine, and made clear that the US and our allies would respond with strong economic and other measures in the event of military escalation. So tonight we will explore what has been happening and what Canada, the United States, our NATO allies, and Ukraine can do to counter this escalation of Russia's aggression. We are very pleased to have with us tonight Dr. Alexandra Lanoszka, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science in the Balkan School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo. He is also the co-leader of the European NATO subgroup of the Defense and Security Foresight Group, and writes widely on issues related to Eastern Europe and security. We are also very pleased to have with us Dr. Balkan Devlen, who is a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute, where he leads the transatlantic program and the director of the Center in Modern Turkish Studies and adjunct professor at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. He is also a widely known and respected expert on security and NATO and Eastern Europe here in Canada and in Ottawa. Before I turn it over to our two speakers, I would ask Alexandra Chyczij, who is the national president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and also the vice president of the Ukrainian World Congress, and she is the executive director of the Canadian Corporate Counsel Association, the national voice of the in-house council in Canada, and previously was CEO and executive director of the Advocates Society, and before that practiced civil litigation. She has been the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress since December 2018. Alexandra, please invite you for some brief remarks before we begin our two presentations.
Thank you, Otis. Welcome to everyone on behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Thank you to our partners for this evening's presentation, and especially to our speakers, Dr. Lanoszka and Dr. Devlen. We're looking forward to your presentations very much and to a lively discussion. In the last weeks, as Russia has undertaken a dramatic military buildup near Ukraine's borders and in Ukrainian territory that is already under Russian occupation, there have been many articles and headlines asking the penultimate question, will Russia invade Ukraine? It's very important to remember that Russia has already invaded Ukraine. That was 8 years ago. And there's been a shooting war in the east of Ukraine since that time. Every day, Ukrainian soldiers defending their territory are being shot at, killed, or wounded. So this latest military buildup is just a continuation of the war that Russia has waged in Ukraine since 2014. This 8-year war and the current buildup is first and foremost about the Russian regime's desire to once again subjugate Ukraine. But it's also about the rules that govern the international order, which Russia seeks to upend. As US Secretary of State Tony Blinken said on Sunday, but there is something even bigger at stake here, and it's the basic rules of the road of the international system. Rules that say that one country can't change the borders of another by force. One country can't exert a sphere of influence over others. That is what Russia is purporting to assert. And if we let that go with impunity, then the entire system that provides for stability, that prevents war from breaking out, is endangered. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress will continue to advocate for strong support of Ukraine by Canada and our allies, because standing up for Ukraine and the rights of Ukrainians to live free in their own country also means standing up for the values and principles for which Canada and Canadians stand. So thank you to everyone this evening for joining us. Over to our speakers.
Thank you for the introduction. I'll be focusing my remarks largely on Russian war aims or policy goals as regards to the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine, as well as the current buildup on Ukraine's border. I think the war aims and the goals of Russian course of diplomacy are generally much more expansive than those often discussed in the Western media. It is not just about the Minsk Accords or getting Ukraine to abide by some unequal arrangement relating to the Donbass. I think the basic issue is that Russian leaders, not necessarily Russian citizens at large, have difficulty reconciling themselves with the notion that Ukraine is an independent sovereign state capable of deciding domestic and foreign policy for itself. And indeed, we have seen Ukraine in fits and starts tilt more and more in the direction of integrating itself in Euro-Atlantic institutions. And with that in mind, I think it is safe to say that Russian foreign policy towards Ukraine since 2014, 2015 has largely been that of failure, precisely because Russia is losing a lot of its political levers over that country. And I would think that the military buildup is an effort, perhaps a desperate effort, to reverse that very failure. Nor are the aims really about NATO enlargement. The Kremlin knows that because of internal division within the alliance, Ukraine's prospects for membership are unfortunately dim, whatever the promises contained in the 2008 Bucharest Summit Declaration, which stated that eventually Georgia and Ukraine would become members. And so Russia has made demands about Ukraine receiving military assistance in general. Now, it's very easy to exaggerate what sort of military assistance Ukraine is in fact getting, but that military assistance has expanded in recent years, so much so that we were seeing more and more cooperative arrangements concluded between Ukraine and some other Western European countries, not the least of which is the United Kingdom. But even today, Sweden and Ukraine announced an update to the defense cooperation agreement that they had signed in the early 2000s. So that speaks again to the issue of Ukraine's growing tilt to the Euro-Atlantic region. Moreover, the substance of Russian diplomacy in the last 2 weeks has really articulated a fairly grandiose vision of European security that would see Russia play a privileged security role in East Central Europe, whereby there would be a new concert of Europe that would have precedence over NATO. And so Russia has called for fixed legal guarantees that would relate to the repudiation of the 2008 Bucharest Summit Declaration, the non-deployment of offensive strike systems in countries adjacent to Russia. Presumably, this would even include Finland's recent order of F-35s from the United States, which number about 64. Russia also has demanded limits on NATO military exercises, as well as limits on navigation in waters like the Black Sea. And complementing this grandiose vision, of course, is an uptick in anti-Western and anti-NATO rhetoric coming from the Kremlin. So I think we need to take that rhetoric seriously in how we're assessing Russian war aims or Russian policy goals. Now, is this all bluster? That's tempting to think that it is. We have seen some war scares in the past. However, I think this time is different. Russia has been putting into place sufficient military forces along multiple vectors on Ukraine's borders to undertake offensive operations should they choose to do so. Now, some of these operations, like the amphibious landings that might take place near Odessa, could very well be feints, but the scale of the buildup is such that if it is a bluff, it is a very expensive bluff indeed. Now, some might argue that these operations are implausible because they're irrational, they're too costly, they just don't fit with Russian foreign policy, because Russian foreign policy presumably is fairly risk averse under Putin and so forth and so forth. Perhaps, however, unfortunately, there is a chance that the Russian leadership may in fact believe in its own narratives. Public opinion might still count for something in today's Russia, but the fact of the matter is that its tight control of the media and its cowed opposition, after all, there are no anti-war protests going on whatsoever in major cities like Moscow, suggests an insularity where bad ideas can percolate. And this has happened in the past historically, so there's no reason to think that it cannot repeat itself here. Of course, a major military escalation would be bad for Ukraine, but it would also be fairly bad for Russia too, because I think it'd be much costlier than leaders in the Kremlin might surmise. Ultimately, war is an ineffective policy instrument. We're seeing that more or less being the case in Eastern Ukraine already, in part because of issues relating to what Clausewitz, that grand Prussian theorist, would say about war with respect to friction and uncertainty. As such, the reaction of the West, I think, is very critical to communicate in no uncertain terms over the consequences of any such military buildup or any use of the military forces postured near Ukraine's border for the purposes of undertaking territorial annexation or some form of offensive military operations. I think the Biden administration has fumbled at times, especially over some of its messaging and diplomacy, though it has been good at using intelligence on the buildup to rally NATO members and to call out Russia, has sometimes preferred speaking only with a handful of NATO countries and Western European countries at that, while indulging in some of the Kremlin's own anti-NATO grievances by expressing an openness to discuss them, however ill-founded they are. Its attitude towards Nord Stream 2 has been confusing at times, saying that the construction of that pipeline is inevitable, but other times declaring an intent to halt its construction. But to its credit, the Biden administration has sought to correct such mistakes and has tried to regain control of the narrative. Now, I think the jury is still out on the performance of the Biden administration, precisely because this is still very much an active situation. But it is imperative that it pursues diplomacy in such a way that it is inclusive not only of the wider NATO membership, but also of Ukraine, because after all, this is ultimately about Ukraine. And so the door must be left open for major economic sanctions and new military deployments in East Central Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Dr. Devlen, and just remind everyone that you can type in any questions you have into the Q&A function, which we will answer after Dr. Devlen's presentation. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you to UCC for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to come and talk, especially with my friend Alexander here. It's a hard act to follow after his excellent overview, I think, of the situation. I'll try to keep my remarks brief so that we have sufficient time for Q&A, which I think will be the most interesting part for the audience. So I will mainly talk about two things, two topics. One, partly Alexander dealt with, and that is what is the end game. The second part is what happens so that the deterrence fails and we end up in war. So what went wrong there, and what are the conditions under which we could see another Russian invasion in Ukraine? To start with the end games, we need to at least think about four of them. Alexander mentioned a few. The first one is, of course, how this particular crisis ends. What is the end game here? Does it end with another Russian invasion? Does it end with some sort of a compromise? Does it end with Russia being deterred and demobilized? Does it end with a continuing, or it doesn't end in a continuing stalemate stretches in the next 6 months or so? So that's number one to understand. But we need to understand this particular crisis in a broader context of what the other end games out there are, and because it only makes sense within this broader set of relations. The second sort of end game we need to think about is what Putin wants. Both Alexandra in her opening statements, as well as Alexander, I think, pointed out clearly that what really Putin wants is what I term the vassalization of Ukraine, a permanent vassalization of Ukraine, with the idea that would provide Russia with the seat at the table, a privileged seat at the table in determining the future European security architecture and confirming Russia's great power status. I think the ultimate aim, either through coercive diplomacy, through war, through economic or political blackmailing, the ultimate aim for Kremlin is to achieve that. And Putin perceives Ukraine and keeping Ukraine as a vassal state as the cornerstone of this project. So we need to understand the current situation as another mechanism in which Putin tries to ensure that Ukraine cannot, break free from Kremlin's grasp. The third thing we need to figure out and then think about the end game wise is the future of Western and Russian relations. Where do we see this particular set of relations move forward? One can talk about a multiplicity of dimensions here, but I would argue, and I'll be happy to expand on that in the Q&A, I would argue that it is what we need to really sort of focus on is containment 2.0. And the containment, of course, have two parts, not only sort of reacting to the adversaries, in this case, Russia's moves, but also culminating and focusing on the domestic front and making the case for why this matters, why our standing up for our partners and allies abroad makes sense. And I would argue that it is very hard for the West to find a way to move forward with the current regime in Kremlin, and we need to think about a post-Putin era eventually when it comes. But up until that time, we really need to focus on containing the adversary, and that starts with recognizing that Russia is the adversary, is one of the adversaries, at least for the West. And then the fourth one is, of course, what's the future of Western-Ukrainian relations? And I think here, like Alexander pointed out, it's important to ensure a firmer integration of Ukraine into Euro-Atlantic structures. To be frank, I cannot see in the foreseeable future Ukraine being a member of NATO, but that doesn't mean that bilateral relations and further institutional relations cannot be strengthened and deepened in a similar way with Sweden and Finland and their relationship with NATO, and thus provide the necessary tools and hardening for Ukrainian defense and further integration. And this is on the military side, and of course on the economic and political side, more can be done through EU. In other words, firmly embedding Ukraine in the Euro-Atlantic structures while working with the willing NATO partners such as Canada, United States, the Baltic states, and Poland, and others like Turkey, to work closely with Ukraine to strengthen those ties. So we need to think about the current crisis within this broader circumstance. What is the risk or the probability of another Russian invasion in the next, say, 3.5 months, in the first quarter of 2022? I would say the current state is about perhaps 15% likely. And I'll be happy to expand how I come up with this number and why I think this is the case. But it's important to note that I actually did walk down from about 35% only a couple of weeks ago, because I think the meeting with Biden and Putin and the follow-up meetings with allies and the G7 announcements and so on and so forth, suggests that the West is delivering, I think, a clear, credible, and capable deterrence signal, deterrence by punishment rather than deterrence by denial, by clearly laying out the costs that will be imposed on Russia in the case of an invasion. Now, what might happen that this fail, and this is going to be my last point, my last minute. In other words, why I might be wrong and we might see an invasion. I presume at 50% now. I used to be at 35%. I'm down to 15 now. Why I might turn out to be wrong. I think there are 4 different ways in which I could be wrong. There are, of course, multiple other ways I could be wrong, but I think 4 main ways I think I can be wrong. First, Putin misperceives the signal. He basically doesn't believe that the West would go ahead with those sanctions, including the SWIFT option and targeting Russian businesses and corporations and turning off Nord Stream 2 and all other associated public and behind the closed door sanctions and economic measures. So he doesn't believe it. He thought that it was just bluffing, and he decides to move on. The second way why we might end up in war is that Putin might be thinking that it is cheaper to move now than to move later. If he believes that the conflict is inevitable, and if he thinks he has only a limited window of opportunity to take advantage, while the US is very much focused on China, there is a power transition in Germany and elsewhere, this is his opportunity. So he's willing to bear the cost now because he thinks in the future it might be higher. The third one is, of course, that he might actually bought into his own hype, a point that Alexander highlighted, and thinks, creating sort of all kinds of echo chambers, and believes that either the operation could be less costly, can be can make Ukraine and the West cave in after a short but sort of a shock and awe operation, and can get what he wants through the use of force with less cost than it actually end up being. And lastly, he might again, there's a lot of talk that he really thinks about his own position in history, and therefore that might he can convince himself that this is the time for him to act. Otherwise, he would go down the Russian history as sort of the Tsar that lost Ukraine, and he doesn't want to do that. And given his age, given his increasing isolation within his elite circle and so forth, it might very well likely that he has a very sort of distorted understanding of what is going on, and might think that this is his way to go. So these are all different ways in which I could be wrong, and that we could have an invasion. But my line would be today that we are looking about a 50% chance of invasion in the next 3 months or so, and that we should focus on deterring and making sure that these other pathways don't happen, but also place this the current crisis in the broader context in which we need to think about Western-Russian relations, Western-Ukrainian relations, as well as what the ultimate goals for Putin are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both for very interesting and engaging opening remarks. We will turn over to some questions now. We have about 35 or 40 minutes for questions, so please do type any that you have in the boxes or in the Q&A session. I guess the first question is, I just want to raise something that wasn't really touched on, and that is the domestic political calculation, both in Russia and for Putin vis-a-vis Ukraine. So to what extent does his own domestic situation play into any calculations that that the Russian regime may be making? And conversely, how does the Ukrainian domestic political situation play into any calculations that he may have about what to do next? So I'll leave it to either one, whoever wants to go first.
I can go first on that very question. I think he actually has a lot of leeway. I think there are not many constraints that stand in his way. I think there was a Levada poll that had come out just in the last 24 hours, showing that a majority of respondents believe that NATO is in fact responsible for the current crisis. I think the number was about 4%, so almost within the margin of error. I believe Russia itself was responsible. So that tells you several things. That tells, or it could tell you several things. One is that the Kremlin has been very good at disseminating its own version of events onto its own public. Could also point out to general apathy. Like I mentioned in my remarks, there is no anti-war protests. Not that anti-war protests would necessarily stop a military action. That did not happen with the United States or Great Britain in 2003 vis-a-vis Iraq, but it does signal to leaders some potential costs, some potential domestic blowback, but that's simply absent here. So I think what is really operative are the sorts of ideas that the Kremlin have, how those ideas relate to the use of force, and how those ideas relate to the status of Ukraine, and how force can be achieved towards those specific ends. So I think there's quite a bit of leeway there.
And I would agree with Alexander on that. He has a lot of leeway to move into domestic politics, and I would also think that the perception do matter in the sense that when we consider what the extent to which that the Russian Federation went into sort of dealing with or hiding or sort of playing down the number of Russian soldiers killed in Donbass, in Syria and other places, suggests that there is some level of sensitivity within the regime to that, and in any kind of full-scale invasion of Ukraine would make those kind of casualties look like a walk in the park, given the resistance that Ukrainians will be putting up against the invading forces, and will be very, very hard. Unlike the ones that they're doing with Syria, for example, will be unlike to hide those body bags and other things, and that would create that might end up shattering the image of Putin as the guy who the strongman image that he very carefully calculated, and forcing him to eat in a way the humble pie will present a domestic threat to him and to his regime. And therefore I think although he has a lot of leeway to move one way or another, that the margin of error there for him to do so is quite limited. And when you start having higher costs associated with the military intervention, that might lead to much worse outcome for Putin's regime than he would assume. So I think there's it's a double-edged sword there with the public opinion. It might look apathetic today, it might look uninterested today, but that can flip relatively quickly if things and when things go south, where they're in invasion.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions that are not really related, but sort of are. So one question we have is, can you comment on what seems to be a turn in Canada's policy, where one week we were seeing, newspaper reports about perhaps Canada putting in CF-18s on Ukrainian territory and buttressing up the Canadian mission there. And then we heard also the Chief of Defense Staff, General Iyer, saying there's no plans at all to expand Operation Unifier. So that seemed like a bit of a change in approach from the Canadian government week to week. And then the other question, which is sort of related to that, is do you perceive a scenario where NATO countries on the eastern flank, so Poland and the Baltic countries, may offer up direct military assistance despite the fact that Western NATO allies seem not to be willing to do so right now. So please.
I can take a stab at these questions. I'll take the first one. I've never heard of any discussion about CF-18s being deployed to Ukraine. If there was that discussion, that must have been hearsay. There was discussion, of course, relating to Operation Unifier and how many soldiers should comprise that mission, or and where they should be deployed within Ukraine. But you heard someone very well qualified to speak about that in this very forum. And I think the answer there is that there will be a lot of continuity as regards to that mission. The numbers will more or less remain stable, although they're headquartered fairly far from the line of contact. There are a number of individuals taking part in Operation Unifier that are scattered around the country, including Kyiv, and I think Mariupol is one such place too. So I wouldn't say necessarily that this is a tripwire force, but they are around. And I'm not sure if the Canadian Armed Forces can absorb more deployed personnel in Ukraine, considering all the heavy lifting that's happening with respect to national disasters, as well as the deployment in Latvia. But I think there'll be much more continuity than any change anyway. On that particular issue, I think the same would be said about those countries on the eastern flank. I don't believe they'll make any moves to directly insert themselves in any military confrontation between Ukraine and Russia. For one, they didn't do that in 2014 and 2015 when they had an opportunity to do so. Instead, as with regards to Lithuania, they provided military assistance. Lithuania was in fact one of the first, if not the first country to do so. I suspect if hostilities were to escalate, they would simply ratchet up what military assistance they would give, but not in fact insert themselves, because again, there are alliance considerations involved here. They don't want to lose their standing with the rest of NATO. They don't want to embroil the alliance. They want to remain good members of the alliance precisely because they've been receiving a lot of goodies from the alliance or other members by way of local defense and deterrence measures. They don't want to upset that.
And I would just add very quickly to the second point that Alexander highlighted. I think if you really want to stretch and see what will be the sort of end point, the maximum that the eastern flank NATO members might go. And again, I'm not claiming to know what's in the minds of the policymakers, but I would assume if the invasion became a full-scale invasion and an ongoing conflict that stretches over several weeks, months, then we might end up seeing at most military advisors come in and help and so on and so forth. But I very much doubt that we will see any sort of formal positioning and stationing of brigades and so on and so forth from those countries. Well, we might see a few thousand military advisors and special forces and so on and so forth that could help if things end up being stretched over several weeks or months.
There is a Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian battle group, but I don't think it'll be deployed in this instance. No, it's more or less to build interoperability and to pursue military cooperation.
Okay, so on that, speaking of training and military cooperation, what do you think the Ukrainians should be doing now that they perhaps are either not doing, or things that they should be doing more of than they're doing? They are, of course, Ukraine is an actor and a subject in all of this. It's not kind of Russia and the West. Ukraine is the kind of most important part of this in a sense. So what is it that you believe that Ukraine should be doing in order to deter a possible Russian invasion, or should one be more ready for it than it perhaps is right now?
In the short term, don't take the bait. I think one element of Russia's strategy is to go to Ukraine into undertaking some military operation, however limited, to justify a larger military operation that clearly Russia is preparing to undertake. In the medium to long term, I would say that Ukraine should continue cultivating closer defense ties with a select set of NATO partners. We've talked already a little bit about the prospects for NATO membership. I think there's almost universal agreement, at least within NATO, that that's not going to happen. But what Ukraine could do, rather than suffer such an impasse, is to, again, develop closer ties with the United Kingdom, with Canada, with Poland, with Lithuania, with the United States, not necessarily to bypass NATO, but to build military interoperability, other skill sets, and even obtain assistance. The United Kingdom, for instance, is building surface ships in conjunction with Ukrainian entities. That's the sort of cooperation I think is going to be very beneficial. It's probably some of the cooperation that Putin hates to see. It might be incentivizing him to do the sorts of things that he's doing. But that being said, I think this is a much more fruitful route for Ukraine to help, not necessarily tilt the balance of power, it never will against Russia, but at least to tilt the balance of probabilities to raise the costs of aggression in the future.
And I would very quickly add that an important part is for Ukraine, which I think Ukraine is doing very well right now, is not to lose nerve, in the sense that holding steady and maintaining that position. We don't necessarily see a massive mobilization, for example, in the case of Ukrainian armed forces. We don't see any sort of getting into a mood of war is inevitable, and so on and so forth. So I think holding that nerve and standing the ground without creating or giving sort of any sort of opening or an excuse for Putin to exploit is extremely important. At the same time, trying to make Ukraine a harder target, strengthening both existing infrastructure from air attacks and missiles and so on and so forth, to perhaps engaging further on how to conduct stay behind operations and resistance in the case of an invasion, and focusing on that if worse comes to worse situation, but without, again, maintaining that coolness, cool-headedness, and a sober look, which I think Ukraine is doing very well at this stage, is going to be very important as Kremlin tries to prod and find ways in which they can either make Ukraine cave in or goad the government to make a misstep.
Okay, we have a question about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Just very quickly, for those who perhaps don't know about it, it's a pipeline that connects Germany to Russia through the sea, basically bypassing Ukrainian pipeline, or pipelines, which are being used right now. And so, by many people, the pipeline through Ukraine is viewed as a deterrent to full Russian invasion and the use of air power, et cetera, because they are dependent on that pipeline to get their gas to Europe. And so if and when the Nord Stream 2 pipeline comes online, that will remove some of that deterrent. And the pipeline is complete, but is going through the regulatory sign-off from the German regulator. And so the question around the pipeline is, are you confident that Germany would be willing to suspend the operationalization of Nord Stream 2 in the event of a full-scale invasion? I mean, what we've seen recently is the rhetoric change from the spring and summer, where both Germany and the US were talking about suspension of the pipeline in the event that Russia uses energy as a weapon. And now the rhetoric is suspension of the pipeline if there is a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, thus meaning, that perhaps now Russia can use energy as a weapon as long as it doesn't, full out militarily invade Ukraine. So if you could comment on what you think the likelihood is of this pipeline first coming online, and then should it come online, actually being used as leverage by the West to prevent a full Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I think the pipeline eventually will come online. I think the whether that decision will be delayed or not, because the current coalition government, particularly the Greens, who also have the foreign ministry, have been very vocal in their opposition to the pipeline, and was on record to be much more willing to stand up for Kremlin, against Kremlin in German politics. So I think every coalition government have their own thing. I'm not sure the current German coalition will be able to sort of or the Greens will have enough to be able to completely suspend the pipeline coming online indefinitely, but I think they will be able to delay it significantly. But in the case of an invasion, first, I hope that will be the least that Germany can do to shut that off, and needs to be much more. I'm pretty sure that that will be the case. That it will be shut off. I cannot see any. I can't see any. I don't think the current German government or the defense and security establishment will be so short-sighted to continue to have that operate while there is a war going on in Europe, a clean territorial aggression against a European country. I cannot, see that sort of behavior from Germany coming up. If that's end up being the case, NATO will be very much in trouble in terms of alliance cohesion going forward. So I think that will definitely happen, and I hope that will be the least that the Germany would do, and would actually do more, and would be much more supportive and active in resisting Russian aggression in Ukraine.
No, I'm not very confident that Germany will do such a thing in the event of such a contingency. I think Germany has to repair its reputation in the region, and things like Nord Stream 2 do nothing to mend relations. And even in the last few days, there's news that Germany blocked a Dutch sale of a weapon system through a NATO program intended for Ukraine. So the problem is fairly deep with respect to how Germany is very much wedded to a particular version of Ostpolitik. Nord Stream 2 is symptomatic of that. The Greens are indeed in opposition to Nord Stream 2. They might have the foreign ministry as per this new coalition government, but bargains could be struck within different interests in German society and with government. I'm not sure how it will all play out, but if I were to be a betting man, I would not necessarily wager in an actual cancellation of Nord Stream 2, even in the event of major military escalation against Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. So recently we've seen, some stories, and especially in the American press, about the Biden administration's intention to perhaps pressure Ukraine into making concessions to Russia around the Minsk II agreements, and perhaps holding, elections in what is now Russian occupied territory before the security situation allows, and before Russia pulls its troops out. Now, so those stories are all, citing unnamed administration officials that are then, countered by comments by other administration officials who say, no, we have no such intention on doing anything like that. Can you comment on the likelihood of the first part of that being true, that the Biden administration, in fact, does intend to, in some ways, pressure Ukraine to accept more compromises. And tied to that is, it's all well and good for the Americans to ask Ukraine to do that, but Ukraine is a democracy, and the government, no matter what we may or may not think of it, is responsible to its people and can't just rule by fiat. And so the question then is, should the Americans try to pressure the Ukrainians? What is the likelihood that the Ukrainians could even implement what the Americans would ask them to implement? So 2 questions.
My thoughts here are going to be a little half-formed, so please forgive me. I think we need to step back and consider the larger context here. So yes, there are these news stories that suggest that the Biden administration is contemplating putting pressure on Ukraine to make these sorts of territorial concessions. Although Don Fried today, who's the US envoy to the region passing through Kyiv, have of course said that such rumors are merely disinformation. But that's, again, the context is important, because from the Biden administration's perspective, that is what Ukraine is supposed to do as per the Minsk Accords. Of course, there's another side to the Minsk Accords, and that is what Russia is supposed to be doing, which it has not been doing. But if the Biden administration is going to put any sort of pressure on Ukraine to that effect, presumably it'll do so with the insistence of bringing the Minsk Accords back online. I think, though, this indicates a total lack of imagination on the part of the Biden administration. I think the Minsk Accords are not credible anymore. There are a set of peace agreements that were born of very specific circumstances in late 2014 and early 2015. And both sides, to varying degrees, have not really abided by those terms. And when I say both sides, I mean Russia not pulling support from certain groups within Eastern Ukraine, not moving heavy equipment. There's, of course, debate on what the Ukrainian side could be doing with respect to special elections in the East. But even so, Ukraine has been very successful in doing a number of things that Russia did not want it to do, namely the integration Euro-Atlantic institutions that has ensued since 2014, not the least of which is actually signing the association agreement that more or less started this entire mess, at least from Russia's perspective. So I think what the Biden administration ought to be doing is not to put pressure on Ukraine to make these unilateral territorial concessions, but to basically say to everyone, including Germany and France, that the Normandy process has not really yielded the things that it was supposed to produce, that the Minsk Accords are stillborn, that fresh thinking is on the table to bring in maybe other actors with more direct interests than simply France and Germany, maybe Poland and the United Kingdom, for example, to have a peace that actually acknowledges the reality on the ground, which is to say that Russia is simply not getting its way. It's not able to impose a victor's peace as what the Minsk Accords had originally indicated. So again, I think those rumors with regard to the Biden administration need to be put in the context of the Minsk Accords, but that doesn't make the Biden administration look much better. It just shows that, if anything, they simply lack any political imagination here.
And I would add that perhaps, as you meant, as you sort of implied in your question, or as there might be also a struggle about how to react to this. Some within the Biden administration would like to appease Russia by engaging this sort of a grand bargain, or what they imagine to be a grand bargain, and for a variety of reasons, either it is it's their preferred choice, or if they want to focus on something else, and so forth, compared to others who would like to take a more stronger and principled stance and not engage in this sort of bargaining over the sovereignty and independence of other countries. So I think there seems to be also a struggle going forward. And I think putting aside the sort of immoral nature of advocating that the U.S. administration should bargain with another power over the sovereignty and territorial integrity and the political independence of Ukraine, It is also, I think, politically extremely sort of naive and myopic in the sense that it assumes, like you pointed out, it assumes that this can be done by fiat. There is this mechanism in which Biden would tell Zelensky and he would do whatever that is, and that's not how the world works. I mean, this is not the 19th century where the great powers sit together and work out a map and then basically send telegrams or whatever have you with the declarations. So it betrays a very faulty and distorted understanding of how international politics work, and it actually also plays, maybe unwittingly, into the Kremlin narrative that this is something that needs to be solved between Russia and the United States, that completely disregards and ignores the agency of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people in this situation. So it's not only immoral to push for that, but it also is not practical because we're not in the 19th century anymore.
They didn't even work in the 19th century.
Okay, so we have another question here about Ukraine mobilization. So it was mentioned that it's important that Ukraine maintain a steady hand, not fall for provocations and so forth. So thoughts, please, to the counterpoint that potentially this can lead to a lack of preparation, and which results in more Ukrainian military losses and loss of territory by not mobilizing, reserves or territorial defense forces in order not to provoke Russia by doing so.
No, I think that fear is misplaced. I think there have been territorial defense units that have been mobilized and that have been training. I think there's a higher readiness. They might not be attacking Russian forces or Russian-backed forces, but that does not mean that they're not doing anything. To the contrary, they're doing quite a bit. So they ought to be holding the line and responding, to what forms of aggression is in fact happening, because there are snipers, there is shelling, but to do so within certain rules of engagement in a proportionate and fairly localized manner. But for the rest of the Ukrainian armed forces, it's I'm not too concerned about their readiness. I think it doesn't seem like they're doing anything, but they're doing quite a bit.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add. I totally agree with Alexandra. I think there's a lot being done, and in a very sober and clear-eyed way, I think, and that's a very important point to highlight.
I will add, though, that I think it's very unfortunate in the United States. There is this perception of Ukraine that's very negative. I'm not sure where it's coming from. I'm not sure if it's stereotype or whether it's just rooted in ignorance. But there is this lack of recognition in the United States. And I'm not saying that the person who posed this question shares in that ignorance, not at all. But I'm just using the opportunity to make this observation, because I do see fairly well-placed individuals make arguments to the effect that the Ukrainian military in 2021 is much the same military as in 2014. That's absolutely absurd. Has made tremendous strides in its command and control structures, in training, in boosting standards and interoperability with even NATO countries. It's not the same military whatsoever. It's much stronger military in 2014 than what was the case in 2014, which was really hollowed out from the Yanukovych years. Of course, Russia's military is much stronger too since 2014, but I think we need to give credit to where credit's due with the Ukrainian military.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. So one question here is this current escalation follows a fairly well-traveled Russian modus operandi, which is asking for grandiose concessions that he knows he can't be granted in order to receive other concessions in other areas. In the meantime, turning up the temperature using the movement of these forces basically then to return to a status quo on his end while getting some concessions from the West or from Ukraine. So, this strategy is pretty well known, and yet Western governments seem to fall into it, have fallen into it more than once during this war. So what do you think the West should be doing differently this time so not to fall into that same trap?
I would say, first being reactive and waiting for the other shoe to drop each time is not a sustainable policy towards Russia from the Western side. I think what we need to start thinking is more proactive. How the West could position itself as well as its partners, primarily Ukraine in this case, so that these rehearsed script no longer works. And again, it also raised the trouble or the problem from Kremlin's perspective is that if all this mobilization, bringing troops, ratcheting up the rhetoric and threatening war is if you end up getting what you end up only getting is a series of meetings with American presidents, where would you go next time when you want something else, right? So it is a dead end in one sense for Putin to recognize, and I think making sure that he recognizes this sort of ratcheting it up each time when he wants to talk is not going to produce anything more than talk. Is an important message that needs to get across. And I think going back to what I said in my opening remarks, we need to get a clearer idea about the nature of this regime, what it wants, and how we need to react to it. Assuming that there is this mythical legitimate grievances and all that kind of thing, and buying into the Russian narrative of trying to address that it doesn't get us anywhere. It only led to further exploitation of the same by Kremlin. So we really need to draw a line and recognize Russia as the adversary it is under the current regime, and both explain this to our own populations, but also adjust our expectations and relations with the Russian Federation accordingly, and not some sort of a series of misunderstandings where fundamentally we want the same thing. We don't want the same thing, and that's kind of clear, and we should make that very clear and draw the line and recognize that.
I think there have been a number of Western governments that have engaged in a lot of wishful thinking with respect to Russia. We talked about Germany and how its strategy was predicated on this notion that with trade, you can effect change. That has not worked out whatsoever. Policy failure. I'm not sure how much foreign policy change there will be with the new coalition government. They seem to be emphasizing continuity, which I'm not sure is a good thing, but that's at least the message that they're saying there. But we see this even in the United States. And I think one of the problems with the Biden administration's foreign policy strategy at the outset was that it was focused almost singularly on the China problem, when it was very obvious that in so doing, you're going to neglect other problems that will not only persist, but will have a way of surprising you. So if there's any positive takeaway from this situation, I would hope that involves disabusing at least the Biden administration from thinking that it can pursue a China-only strategy. It can pursue a China-first strategy, but it cannot pursue a China-only strategy. It can certainly prioritize China, but it cannot emphasize China so much so that Russia becomes a blind spot, because we're seeing indeed what happens when Russia decides to assert itself in a way that obviously calls for American attention. So to answer the question, I don't want to be optimistic here, because there is this pattern that the person asking the question did point out. But I'm hoping at least that with present administration, they'll become a lot more skeptical.
Okay, we have time for one more question, which is about sanctions. So there's been a lot of reporting and talk about the possibility of using SWIFT as leverage. To what extent has the last 8 years during which Russia's been living under sanctions prepared Russia for the escalation of those sanctions, and also to what extent is a tool like SWIFT effective with a regime that really doesn't particularly care about its own people? So the question is, like, when we talk about increasing sanctions, is that actually a tool that changes the thinking of the Russian regime?
So one of the weird things about the last 8 years is that a lot of people, a lot of countries have been engaging in coercion, and there has been almost no strategic success enjoyed by anybody. And in fact, that points to a general observation that people have, that coercion is very hard to do successfully. And so when we're dealing with issues like war, where individuals have more or less staked their claims and have done so in a cost acceptant or risk acceptant manner, it's very difficult to move the needle. So in the case of Russia, it accepts that it will face costs, it will encounter sanctions. And indeed, in the last few years, has built up a fairly impressive strategic currency reserve, presumably one that will help it weather a fresh round of sanctions. So perhaps expecting that something will be done. But again, we're dealing in a world where we've all sort of selected into fairly high levels of conflict. And it's really difficult to dislodge the other side from their position, to get them to change their interest, to coerce them. I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but I think it's closer to the ground truth. Coercion is extremely difficult. And it's difficult for Russia, as it has discovered in Ukraine, and it's difficult for us, as we've discovered with Russia.
And I would add that that's precisely, it's more important to use these threats as a part of the deterrent posture, as in deterrence by punishment, rather than trying to use sanctions when deterrence fails as a tool for compellence, right? I think coercing, once the invasion starts, coercing Russia to stop that through the economic sanctions will be a lot more harder than threatening sanctions as a way to increase the potential cost before that decision is taken. So trying to effect that cost-benefit analysis before the action is more important. And I would argue that, Russia is, of course, much more sort of integrated in the international economy. The sale of natural resources, etc., provide an important mechanism in which they fund these foreign adventures and foreign policies. And despite the fact that they build up $650 billion of a war chest in terms of hard currency and stuff, will perhaps cushion some of the blow, but that cannot be lost forever. So there will be an impact on that. But more importantly, I think, going after Putin and his clique and the kleptocratic nature of the regime, and making clear that this will be the case in the case of an invasion, I think will be much more important than broad-based sanctions against Russia. You're targeting the oligarchs, targeting their bank accounts, Putin's close circle, Putin himself, their wealth, their properties, and so on and so forth, would be a good way to start. And of course, that should start at home by focusing attention on the enablers here in the West for the Russian kleptocracy, enable them to launder that money, enable them to plunder the resources, and use that to pursue these aggressive foreign policy aims, and making it clear that they will be personally, their families, their properties, their bank accounts, all the oligarchs and the regime leaders and the elite will be personally affected. I think will be one way to shift the cost calculus, in addition to this broader sanctions. But it is better to do it. It's more effective as a deterrent rather than as a compellent measure, as Alexander pointed out.
Okay, it's now 5 minutes after 8 o'clock, and we said we would go until 8. So again, thank you, Dr. Lanoszka, Dr. Devlen, for what was a truly fascinating and informative discussion. Thank you to our partners at the Macdonald Laurier Institute and the Central and Eastern European Council in Canada. And thank you everyone who joined us tonight. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There's just been too many. We will, of course, continue to bring you these types of events, and I think we will have both of you back with your permission in the future. And so once again, thank you, Дякую, merci, Dobranic, and until next time.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.